Jake Morrison had been running his cattle ranch in Montana for 15 years, and he thought he had seen everything that life could throw at him. He had survived brutal winters where the temperature dropped so low that water froze in seconds. He had endured droughts that turned his green pastures into brown dust. He had dealt with cattle thieves and wild animals and equipment failures that cost him thousands of dollars, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the day when a massive alien appeared at his fence line. The being stood 12 feet tall and his skin was bronze-colored with a strange shimmer like heated metal under sunlight. His eyes glowed with an amber light that seemed to look straight through Jake. He wore clothing made from material that looked like leather but moved differently, and it was decorated with geometric patterns that reminded Jake of Native American designs he had seen in museums. The alien spoke through a small device attached to his belt, and the words came out in perfect English, though the voice had a strange echo to it. The alien introduced himself as Chief Nakota of the Kasha Confederation, and he explained that his people had been watching Earth for many years. The Kasha were warriors and explorers who traveled among the stars looking for new worlds and new people to learn from. They valued honor above all things, and they respected strength, both physical and mental. When humanity finally made official contact with alien races 6 months earlier, the Kasha were among the first to ask permission to visit Earth's surface. They were particularly drawn to the wide open spaces of North America because it reminded them of their own homeworld. Chief Nakota had been studying the humans who lived in this region, and he had chosen Jake Morrison for a very specific reason. Behind the chief stood 3 female Kasha, and each of them was over 10 feet tall with the same bronze shimmer to their skin and the same glowing amber eyes. They looked strong enough to bend steel with their bare hands, and they stood with the rigid posture of soldiers waiting for orders. The chief gestured to them and began to explain why he had come to Jake's ranch. The 3 females were sisters named Kayla, Nira, and Zeta, and they had committed an offense against their people during a sacred ceremony. The chief explained that Kasha culture was built around hunting rituals that tested courage and discipline, and these 3 sisters had violated the rules of such a hunt. They had acted with individual compassion when they should have followed the group's commands, and because of this they had endangered others and brought dishonor to their family. As punishment and as a way to teach them humility and the value of cooperation, they were being sent to live with a human who would teach them Earth's ways. The chief had observed Jake for weeks, and he had seen how the rancher worked his land alone with determination and fairness. He had watched Jake help a neighbor whose barn burned down even though that neighbor had never been friendly to him. He had seen Jake spend hours caring for a sick calf that any other rancher would have simply written off as a loss. These actions showed the chief that Jake Morrison understood honor in a way that transcended culture and species. But then the chief said something that made Jake's stomach drop. According to Kasha tradition, when females were placed under the protection and guidance of a male from outside their clan, it required a formal bond. This bond was not just about teaching or employment, but about taking responsibility for their well-being and their future. In Kasha culture, this type of bond was considered a form of marriage, and it carried serious obligations and rights. The chief made it clear that this was not optional. If Jake agreed to take the sisters, then he would be bound to them by Kasha law and custom. He would be responsible for their safety, their education, and their honor. They would be his to guide and protect, and in return they would serve his household and learn from his example. The chief spoke with such formality and gravity that Jake understood this was not some casual arrangement but a sacred duty that the Kasha took very seriously. Jake stood there in his dusty boots and worn jeans looking up at this massive alien who had just told him he was about to become responsible for 3 giant alien women. His first instinct was to laugh because the whole situation was absolutely insane. His second instinct was to refuse because who in their right mind would agree to such a bizarre arrangement? But something stopped him from saying no. Maybe it was the way the 3 sisters stood there looking uncertain and almost vulnerable despite their size. Maybe it was the desperate hope he saw in the chief's glowing eyes. Maybe it was simply that Jake Morrison had never been the type of man to turn away someone who needed help, even if that someone was an alien from another world. He looked at the 3 sisters and they looked back at him, and in that moment he made a decision that would change all their lives forever. Before Jake could say anything formal, the chief began a ceremony. He spoke in the Kasha language with deep resonant words that seemed to vibrate in Jake's chest. The translation device rendered some of it into English, and Jake caught phrases about protection and teaching, and mutual respect and honor. The chief touched each sister on the shoulder while speaking their names, and then he placed one massive hand on Jake's shoulder and spoke more words that the device translated as an oath of guardianship. The whole thing took maybe 5 minutes, but when it was done, Jake felt different somehow, as if something invisible but very real had just been established between him and these 3 alien women. The chief explained that he would return in exactly 1 Earth year to assess the sisters' progress and determine if they had learned what they needed to learn. Until then, they were Jake's responsibility in every sense of the word. The chief gave Jake some final instructions about Keisha dietary needs and cultural sensitivities, and then he told the sisters something in their own language that made them stand even straighter. Without another word, he turned and walked back to where his shuttle was hidden beyond the tree line. The sound of its engine starting was like thunder, and then it was gone, rising into the Montana sky and disappearing among the clouds. Jake Morrison stood there with 3 10-foot-tall alien women looking down at him, and the silence that followed the chief's departure was so complete that Jake could hear his own heartbeat. His cattle were still grazing peacefully in the distance, completely unaware that their owner's life had just become impossibly complicated. Jake took off his hat and ran his hand through his hair, trying to figure out what to say or do next. The 3 sisters waited quietly, and Jake noticed that despite their size and obvious strength, they looked almost as lost as he felt. Finally, Jake cleared his throat and gestured toward the barn. If they were going to be living here, then they needed a place to stay, and the barn was the only structure big enough to accommodate them. As they walked across the yard, Jake tried to wrap his mind around what had just happened. He had woken up this morning as a bachelor rancher living alone and working his land in peace. Now he was apparently married to 3 alien women by their culture's standards and responsible for teaching them how to survive on Earth. The whole thing was like something out of a bad science fiction movie, except it was real, and those 3 massive beings walking behind him were very real, and they were now his problem to figure out. Jake opened the barn doors and led them inside, wondering how exactly he was supposed to explain this to his neighbors. The first week was complete chaos, and Jake wondered multiple times if he had lost his mind. The Keisha sisters needed so much more than he had anticipated, and every day brought new challenges that he had never considered. The barn needed serious modifications to make it comfortable for beings who were twice his size and several times his weight. Jake spent 2 full days reinforcing the loft floor with extra support beams because he was terrified the whole structure would collapse under the combined weight of 3 Keisha. He drove into town multiple times to buy industrial-sized sleeping bags and thick foam padding that could serve as mattresses. The store owner, Pete, gave him strange looks, but did not ask too many questions, probably because news about alien visitors had been all over the television and radio for months now. Food became a major concern almost immediately. Jake took the sisters to his kitchen on their second day and showed them what he normally ate, which was simple ranch food like eggs and bacon and bread and vegetables from his garden. Zeta picked up a chicken egg between 2 fingers and held it like it was a fragile treasure. She asked if this really came from the birds they had seen walking around the yard. When Jake confirmed it, she looked amazed and declared that Earth had the strangest animals she had ever seen. That first meal was an experiment, and Jake cooked everything he had in his refrigerator, which turned out to be barely enough to satisfy 1 Keisha, let alone 3. He watched in amazement as Nira consumed a dozen eggs and half a loaf of bread and several pounds of bacon without even looking full. Jake realized he would need to start buying food in bulk quantities that would normally feed a small army. The real education began when Jake started teaching them about ranching, and it became clear that book, learning and actual experience were very different things. He woke them before dawn on their 3rd morning and led them out to the pastures where his cattle were grazing in the early light. The Keisha had never seen Earth cattle before, and they studied the animals with intense curiosity. Jake explained that these creatures provided food and income, and that taking care of them properly was essential to ranch survival. He showed them how to check for signs of illness and how to guide the herd between different grazing areas, and how to maintain the fences that kept them contained. The sisters listened carefully and asked good questions that showed they were taking this seriously. Kayla wanted to know about predators and whether the cattle had natural defenses. Nira was interested in the grass itself, and how Jake managed the pastures to ensure there was always enough food. Zeta asked about the cattle's social structure and whether they had leaders like Kusha warrior bands did. The Kusha strength made some tasks almost comically easy. Jake spent an entire morning showing them how to repair a section of fence and explaining the careful process of digging post holes and setting posts in concrete. Then Kala simply grabbed a metal fence post and drove it into the hard Montana soil with her bare hands, like she was pushing a knife into soft butter. The post went down 3 feet in seconds and stood perfectly straight without any need for concrete or bracing. Jake stood there with his mouth open trying to process what he had just seen. The work that would have taken him hours with machinery had been completed in moments, but other tasks proved much more difficult because they required delicate control that the sisters had not developed. Neera tried to rope a calf that needed medical treatment, and she pulled on the rope with what she probably thought was gentle pressure. The rope snapped like thread, and the calf bolted in terror. Neera looked horrified and apologized profusely while Jake tried not to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Zeta had her own learning experience with gate latches. Jake showed her how to open and close the metal latches that secured the pasture gates and demonstrated the light touch needed to work them properly. But when Zeta tried it herself, she squeezed too hard and the metal latch crumpled in her hand like aluminum foil. She stood there holding the destroyed latch with such a devastated expression that Jake actually felt sorry for her. He explained that earth materials were often weaker than what Kusha were used to, and that they would need to recalibrate their sense of pressure and force. Over the next few days, Jake watched the sisters practice with various objects, learning to control their strength. They would pick up eggs without breaking them and turn door handles without ripping them off, and operate tools without crushing them. It was like watching giants learn to live in a world made of paper. The cattle adapted to the Kusha faster than Jake expected. After a few days of nervousness, the herd seemed to accept the presence of these massive beings. Perhaps their size reminded the cattle of some natural authority, or perhaps animals simply cared less about appearance than humans did. Whatever the reason, Jake was relieved that his livestock did not panic every time the sisters came near them. The horses were more cautious, but even they began to tolerate the Kusha, especially after Zeta started spending time with them. She had a natural gentleness with animals that surprised Jake, and the horses responded to her presence by becoming calmer and more trusting. Zeta explained that on her homeworld she had worked with creatures far larger and more dangerous than horses, and that she had always loved animals more than combat training. Evenings became a time for cultural exchange and learning. After dinner, they would sit together either in the barn or on Jake's porch and talk about their different worlds. Jake told them about human history and about the American frontier and about the ranchers and farmers who had built lives in harsh, unforgiving territory. He explained how his own family had worked this land for generations, and how he had inherited both the ranch and the responsibility to keep it going. The sisters shared stories about Kusha culture and their warrior traditions and their homeworld, which had gravity lower than Earth, making them even stronger here than they were at home. They described massive creatures that roamed their plains and the sacred hunts that tested young Kusha and proved their worth to the tribe. Jake learned that the Kusha valued strength, but not just physical power. They admired resilience and wisdom earned through hardship, and the ability to protect those weaker than yourself. In many ways, their values were not so different from the code Jake had lived by his whole life. One evening, Kayla asked Jake about the bond that Chief Nakota had established. She wanted to know if Jake truly understood what it meant in Kusha culture, or if he was just humoring them until the year ended. Jake thought about his answer carefully before speaking. He told her that he might not understand all the cultural details, but he understood responsibility. He had given his word and participated in their ceremony, and that meant something real to him. In his world, a man's word was his bond, and if he agreed to look after someone, then that was exactly what he would do. He would teach them everything he knew and protect them to the best of his ability, and honor the commitment he had made, even if the circumstances were bizarre. Kala studied him for a long moment and then nodded with what looked like respect. She said that perhaps the chief had chosen better than she had initially thought. That night, Jake lay in his bed listening to the sounds of the ranch and thinking about how much his life had changed in just 1 week. He had 3 giant alien women living in his barn, and he was responsible for teaching them how to survive on Earth. It was insane and impossible, and somehow it was starting to feel almost normal. The second month brought a test that none of them expected, And it came in the form of a massive storm that rolled across the Montana plains with the fury of nature unleashed. Jake had seen bad weather before in his 15 years of ranching, but this storm was something else entirely. The weather reports called it a once-in-a-decade event with high winds that could tear buildings apart and hail large enough to kill livestock and flash flooding that could wash away everything in its path. Jake watched the dark clouds building on the horizon and felt his stomach tighten with worry. He had maybe 3 hours before the storm hit, and there was so much that needed to be done. The cattle had to be moved to higher ground away from the creek that was already swelling with runoff from distant rain. The barn and outbuildings needed reinforcement against winds that were predicted to reach 70 miles per hour. Equipment and supplies had to be secured so they would not become dangerous projectiles in the wind. Jake gathered the 3 Keeshaw sisters and explained the situation quickly. He did not waste time on long explanations because they did not have time. The storm was coming and they needed to work together if they wanted to save the ranch and the animals. To his relief, the sisters did not question or hesitate. Their warrior training became immediately apparent as they moved into action with military precision. Kyla took command of moving the cattle, and she did it with such natural authority that even the most stubborn animals obeyed her. She stood in the pasture like a bronze statue come to life, and used her size and presence to guide the herd toward higher ground, near the ridgeline. The cattle followed her with surprising docility, as if they recognized something in her that demanded respect. Neera focused on structural work, and she moved through the ranch securing buildings with speed and strength that would have required a full construction crew for humans. She reinforced the barn doors with extra bracing and checked every window, and checked the roof for weak spots that might tear away in high winds. Zeta worked alongside, Jake gathering loose equipment and moving anything that could become dangerous in the wind. She asked quick, intelligent questions whenever she was unsure about something, and she learned fast, adapting to each new task without complaint. Jake found himself impressed by how well they worked together, and how the sisters coordinated their efforts without needing constant direction. They had done this kind of emergency preparation before on their own world, and their training showed in every efficient movement. The sky grew darker as they worked, and the wind began to pick up, sending dust devils spinning across the yard. Jake could smell the rain coming and see the lightning flickering inside the massive storm clouds. They had maybe an hour left and still so much to do. He pushed himself harder, moving faster than he had in years, and the sisters matched his pace without showing any sign of fatigue. When the storm finally hit, it was like the sky had opened up to unleash hell itself. The wind came first with a roar that sounded like a freight train bearing down on them. Jake and the sisters had retreated to the barn just minutes before, and now they huddled inside listening to the structure groan and creak under the assault. Rain hammered against the walls with such force that it sounded like gravel being thrown. Hail began to fall, and the sound of ice striking metal roofing was deafening. Jake watched through a crack in the door as hailstones the size of golf balls pounded everything outside, turning the ground white within minutes. The wind tore at the barn doors, and Jake and Neera both had to brace them shut with their combined weight. The Keesha's strength made the difference because Jake knew he could not have held those doors alone against wind that powerful. The worst moment came about an hour into the storm when Jake heard a terrible tearing sound from above. He looked up just in time to see a section of the roof beginning to peel away, as wind found a weak spot and started to exploit it. If that section tore free, the entire roof structure might fail and they would be exposed to the full fury of the storm. Before Jake could even shout a warning, Neera was already moving. She climbed up into the rafters with terrifying speed, her massive hands finding grips that would have been impossible for human fingers. She positioned herself directly under the failing section and simply held it in place, bracing her legs against support beams and using her back and shoulders to keep the roof from tearing away. The wind screamed around her and rain poured through gaps in the metal, but Neera did not move. Zeta climbed up after her sister, carrying emergency repair materials that Jake had stored in the workshop. Together, they worked in conditions that would have been deadly for humans, creating a temporary patch that would hold until the storm passed. The storm lasted 6 hours, and when it finally moved on, Jake and the sisters emerged into a landscape transformed by wind and water. The creek had become a raging river that had jumped its banks and flooded the low pasture. Debris was scattered everywhere, and several sections of fence were down. Tree branches littered the yard, and Jake's old truck had a spiderweb crack across the windshield from a hailstone impact. But the barn was intact and the house had only minor damage, and most importantly, the cattle were safe on the ridge where Kayla had moved them. Jake looked around at the damage and felt a wave of relief wash over him. It could have been so much worse. Without the Keisha sisters, he would have lost animals and probably buildings too. Their strength and speed and coordination had made the difference between survival and disaster. That night, they sat together in the barn, exhausted and covered in mud, but alive and mostly unharmed. Jake looked at the three sisters and saw something different in them now. They were not just aliens he was responsible for teaching. They were partners who had worked beside him to protect something that mattered. They had trusted him to lead them through the crisis, and he had trusted them to do what needed doing without hesitation. Kayla spoke quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. She admitted that when Chief Nakota first gave them this assignment, she had seen it as punishment and exile. She had been angry and ashamed and resentful, but now she was beginning to understand what the chief had really intended. This was not about punishing them. It was about teaching them what truly mattered. Not rigid obedience to tradition, but the ability to work together to protect something worth protecting. It was about learning that strength meant more than just physical power. It meant loyalty and sacrifice and doing what was right even when it was hard. The weeks that followed were spent on repairs and recovery. Jake taught the sisters more advanced skills, from veterinary care to equipment maintenance. They learned how to suture wounds and set broken bones and diagnose common illnesses in cattle. They learned to operate tractors and repair engines and weld metal. In return, the sisters began teaching Jake things from their own culture. Nira showed him Keisha methods for predicting weather patterns that were far more sophisticated than anything Earth meteorology offered. Zeta taught him animal training techniques based on energy and body language that worked surprisingly well with his horses. But it was Kayla who had the biggest impact. She started training Jake in Keisha combat methods not because he needed to fight, but because she said a strong body created a strong mind. The discipline of physical training built mental resilience and focus. Jake, who had always stayed fit through hard work, found himself learning entirely new ways of moving and thinking about his own capabilities. The ranch was changing and growing stronger, but more than that, the four of them were changing, becoming something more than teacher and students or employer and workers. They were becoming a team, and perhaps even something closer than that. News about Jake's unusual household spread through the rural Montana community faster than any wildfire could have traveled. In a place where everyone knew everyone and gossip was the primary form of entertainment, 3 10-foot-tall aliens living on Morrison's ranch was the biggest story in decades. People talked about it in the hardware store and the diner and the post office. Some folks were curious and wanted to know more. Others were suspicious and worried about what having aliens in their community might mean. And a few were outright hostile, seeing the Keisha as a threat or an invasion, or just something unnatural that should not be allowed. Jake had expected some reaction, but he was not prepared for how intense it would become or how quickly his ranch would turn into a focal point for the community's mixed feelings about alien contact. The first visitors were just curious, and they came with the excuse of delivering supplies or asking ranch-related questions, but really they just wanted to see the Keisha for themselves. Pete from the hardware store drove out with his wife Lucy, supposedly to drop off some fence posts, but really to get a good look at the aliens everyone was talking about. They found Zeta in the yard helping Jake repair a broken tractor. The young Keisha was crouched beside the machine, her massive hands working with surprising delicacy on the small engine components, while Jake supervised and gave instructions. When Pete and Lucy pulled up, Zeta straightened to her full height and greeted them politely. Her translation device worked perfectly, and she answered their questions about her homeworld with patience and good humor. She told them about the lower gravity on her planet, and the massive creatures that lived there and the warrior culture she had grown up in. Pete and Lucy left an hour later, clearly impressed and telling everyone in town that the Keisha seemed like decent folks despite being so different. But not everyone was friendly or even polite. A group of local ranchers led by a man named Carl Henderson showed up one afternoon with hostile intentions written all over their faces. Carl had always been competitive with Jake and resentful of his success. He saw the Keisha as either an unfair advantage that Jake was exploiting or just an excuse to cause trouble for someone he disliked. Carl brought 5 other men with him, and they came looking for a confrontation. They started with verbal harassment, making crude comments about Jake living with alien women, and questioning whether he was even still human if he was sharing his life with them. Their tone grew more aggressive, and one of Carl's friends made the mistake of trying to physically intimidate Kayla. He stepped too close to her and puffed out his chest like he was trying to prove something. Kayla simply looked down at the man with her amber eyes, glowing slightly brighter in what Jake had learned was a sign of controlled emotion. She did not move or threaten or say anything. She just stood there, radiating the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how dangerous she was and had absolutely nothing to prove. The man who had tried to intimidate her took an involuntary step backward, and his bravado evaporated like morning mist. Jake stepped between them before things could escalate further. His voice was calm but firm when he told Carl and his friends that the Keisha were under his protection and working his ranch legitimately. Anyone who had a problem with that was welcome to leave his property immediately. The tension in the yard was thick enough to cut, and Jake could feel his heart pounding, but he refused to back down. What finally diffused the situation was both unexpected and perfectly timed. Neera had been working on a section of fence about 50 yards away, and she approached carrying a steel fence post that she had apparently bent into a perfect U-shape with her bare hands. She was not threatening anyone or even looking at the confrontation. She just casually walked over and asked Jake a question about where he wanted the bent post placed for scrap metal. The message was crystal clear without being aggressive. These Keisha could bend steel like it was soft clay, and trying to physically threaten them was the height of stupidity. Carl looked at the bent post and then at Neera and then back at Jake. Without another word, he and his friends got in their trucks and left. Jake watched them drive away and felt his hands shaking with delayed adrenaline. That could have gone very badly, but the sisters had handled themselves perfectly, showing strength, without aggression, and making it clear they were not to be trifled with. Jake knew the incident would spread through the community and people would take sides. Some would see the Keisha as dangerous and others would respect them for not starting a fight they could have easily won. But there were positive responses too, and they came from unexpected places. The local school teacher Helen Rodriguez called the ranch a few days later with an unusual request. She wanted to know if the Keisha sisters would be willing to come speak to her students about their homeworld and their culture. It would be a chance to educate the next generation and build understanding between species. Jake discussed it with the sisters, and after some consideration, they agreed. They were nervous about facing a room full of human children, but they understood the importance of building bridges. The school visit turned out to be a revelation for everyone involved. The children were absolutely fascinated, and they asked endless questions about Keisha life and culture and biology. Zeta shined in this environment, and her youthful energy connected perfectly with the students. She told them about growing up on a world where she could jump 3 times higher than on Earth because of lower gravity. She described the massive creatures her people hunted and the warrior traditions that every Keisha learned from childhood. She talked about their cities built into mountainsides and their ships that could travel between stars. But she also told them about Earth and what she was learning here. She spoke about the value of patience and the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. She described watching the sunrise over the Montana plains and seeing colors she had never imagined. She talked about learning to be gentle with creatures smaller than herself and discovering that strength meant knowing when not to use your power. The children listened with rapt attention, and for many of them, the Keisha stopped being scary aliens from news reports and became real people with stories and feelings and dreams. One little girl asked Zeta if she missed her home, and Zeta answered honestly that she did, but she was also learning to love Earth in its own way. A boy asked if Keisha were stronger than superheroes, and Zeta laughed and said that comic book heroes could do things no real being could. But yes, Keisha were very strong. The visit generated goodwill that no amount of explanation or diplomacy could have achieved. Parents who had been nervous about aliens living nearby started to relax when their children came home excited and talking about the amazing Keisha who had visited their school. The following weeks, more people stopped by the ranch. Some came with questions about Keisha culture or technology. Some came with offers of friendship or help. A few local ranchers asked if the sisters could help with heavy work that normally required expensive equipment, and Jake worked out fair arrangements that helped everyone. The community was slowly accepting the Keisha, or at least accepting that they were there to stay and were not a threat. Jake realized that what was happening on his ranch was bigger than just 4 individuals learning to live together. They were becoming a bridge between species, and a small-scale example of how humans and aliens could coexist and even thrive together. The responsibility of that was both humbling and inspiring. He had not asked for this role, but now that he had it, he was determined to do it right. The sisters were not just his responsibility anymore. They were partners and friends and proof that differences in species did not have to mean conflict or fear. They could mean growth and learning and building something new together. 6 months into their arrangement, the ranch had transformed in ways that went far beyond physical changes. The Kasha sisters were no longer just workers or students learning Earth's ways. They had become integral parts of the operation, and they contributed ideas and innovations that made everything run more smoothly and efficiently. Neera had completely revolutionized the barn's organization, using principles from Kesha engineering and logistics. She created a system of storage and workflow that tripled their efficiency and made it possible to accomplish in 2 hours what used to take Jake all day. Her methodical mind found solutions to problems Jake had not even realized were problems. She also began teaching him about Kasha mathematics and spatial reasoning, which helped him better plan his land use and resource management. Under her guidance, Jake started seeing his ranch not just as separate tasks but as an interconnected system where every part affected every other part. Zeta had become the unofficial ambassador of the ranch, and she handled most interactions with visitors with natural charm and enthusiasm. Her genuine interest in people and her ability to explain complex ideas in simple terms made her a perfect bridge between Kesha and human cultures. She spent hours talking with neighbors and answering questions and building relationships that benefited everyone. She also discovered an unexpected talent for animal husbandry, particularly with horses. The animals responded to her in ways that surprised even Jake, who had been working with horses his entire life. Zeta explained that on her homeworld, she had worked with massive creatures that required patience and gentle energy rather than force. She could read an animal's body language and emotional state with uncanny accuracy, and the horses trusted her completely. Under her care, Jake's small herd became calmer and more cooperative than they had ever been. Kayla, the eldest and most reserved, had been the slowest to adapt emotionally, even though she had always been the most competent at physical tasks. But over the months, Jake noticed changes in her. She smiled more often and she laughed at his dry humor, and she began to show a protective instinct toward the ranch that went beyond mere duty or obligation. One evening, she approached Jake while he was sitting on his porch watching the sunset. She asked if they could talk, and something in her tone made Jake sit up straighter and pay close attention. Kayla sat down beside him, and for a moment she just looked out at the land without speaking. Then she began to tell him about the sacred hunt that had led to their exile, and for the first time she explained what had really happened, that the sisters had not been reckless or disrespectful as the official reports claimed. They had been participating in a traditional hunt with their warrior band when a younger Kesha had gotten separated from the group and found himself in danger from one of their world's apex predators. The creature was massive and deadly, and the young Kesha was going to die if no one helped him. Kayla and her sisters had broken formation and violated the strict protocols of the hunt to save him. They had fought the creature and rescued the young Kesha, but in doing so, they had caused chaos and endangered others. They had been punished not for failing, but for putting individual compassion above collective discipline. In Kesha culture, this was considered a dangerous weakness that could undermine the structure that kept their warrior society functioning. Kayla told Jake that she had accepted the punishment without question at first because that was what Kesha warriors did. But living on Earth had made her question everything she had been taught. She had watched Jake make similar choices, putting the welfare of individual animals above strict efficiency or profit. When one of his calves had been born sick, Jake had spent days nursing it back to health, even though the time and expense made no economic sense. When a neighbor's fence failed and their cattle wandered onto Jake's land, he had helped round them up and repair the fence instead of demanding compensation. These acts of individual compassion had not weakened Jake or his ranch. Instead, they had created loyalty and respect and a network of people who would help him when he needed it. Kayla was beginning to think that maybe what she and her sisters had done during the hunt was not weakness but a different kind of strength. Jake listened to her story without interrupting, and when she finished, he sat quietly for a moment before responding. He told her about his own past, about family he had lost years ago in a vehicle accident. His wife and young daughter had been killed by a drunk driver, and for a long time Jake had not known how to keep living. He had thrown himself into ranching as a way to survive the grief, and slowly the land had healed him. He had learned that life was not about following rigid rules or doing what was most efficient. It was about making hard choices and living with the consequences, and finding meaning in the daily struggle to do right by the people and animals you cared about. Sometimes that meant breaking rules or taking risks that did not make logical sense, but it also meant being true to your own values even when others did not understand. That conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Kayla had opened up about her deepest doubts, and Jake had trusted her with his most painful memories. The bond between them grew stronger and more real. The sisters began to see Jake not just as a teacher or protector, but as someone who understood them on a fundamental level. And Jake, who had been alone for so long, found himself caring about these three aliens in ways that went far beyond the obligation the chief had imposed. The Keisha marriage bond that had seemed so strange and artificial at first was beginning to feel natural and right. In their culture, such bonds were about mutual protection and shared resources and deep loyalty. Jake realized that by any definition that mattered, that was exactly what they had built together. Winter approached and brought new challenges with it. The Montana cold was harsh, and the Keisha, coming from a warmer world, struggled with temperatures that dropped well below freezing. Jake worked with them to improve the barn's insulation, and he installed a proper heating system and created warmer sleeping areas with extra blankets and thermal coverings. The sisters taught him techniques from their world for conserving body heat and maintaining physical activity in extreme conditions. They showed him breathing exercises that increased circulation and movement patterns that generated internal warmth. Jake found these methods surprisingly effective, and he realized that Keisha had adapted to many different environments. During their centuries of space exploration, one particularly brutal night, a blizzard trapped all four of them in the barn. The wind was too strong and the visibility too poor for Jake to make it back to his house safely. Jake's house was too small for the Keisha to use comfortably, so he had always slept there alone. But tonight they all huddled together in the barn, sharing body heat and waiting for the storm to pass. They talked through the long, cold night, sharing stories and fears and hopes they had never voiced before. Zeta spoke about her dreams of someday building something of her own, maybe a ranch like this on a colony world where Keisha and humans worked together. Nira admitted that she had been afraid humans would never truly accept them and that they would always be outsiders no matter how hard they tried to fit in. Jake told them something he had been thinking about for weeks but had not found the courage to say out loud. He said that they were not outsiders and they never had been. They were family. He knew that word might sound strange applied to three giant aliens from another world, but it was the truth as he understood it. Family was not just about blood or species. It was about the people who stood beside you when things got hard. It was about trust and loyalty and caring what happened to each other. By that definition, the four of them were more family than many blood relatives ever managed to be. As he spoke those words and looked at three massive alien faces illuminated by the soft glow of the lantern, Jake felt something settle in his chest. He had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to truly belong to something bigger than himself. Now he remembered, and it felt right. The year passed faster than any of them could have imagined, and spring returned to Montana, bringing new life and new possibilities. The ranch looked completely different from the struggling operation it had been 12 months earlier. The pastures were healthier, and the buildings were in better repair, and the whole operation ran with an efficiency that Jake could never have achieved alone. But more than the physical changes, there was an atmosphere of purpose and belonging that had not existed before. The four of them had become a real unit, working together with the kind of coordination that usually took families decades to develop. As spring progressed, everyone knew that Chief Nakota would be returning soon to assess the sisters' progress, and the knowledge created a tension that grew stronger each day. The sisters grew increasingly nervous as the appointed day approached. They had changed so much during their time on Earth and learned so much about themselves and what truly mattered. But would the chief see that growth, or would he view their adaptation to human ways as another kind of failure? Kasha culture valued strength and tradition, and these sisters had spent a year learning patience and cooperation and compromise. Would that be seen as growth or as weakness? Kayla became quieter and more withdrawn as she worried about facing judgment from her own people. Nira threw herself into work as a way to avoid thinking about what might happen. Zeta tried to maintain her usual cheerful energy, but Jake could see the fear behind her smiles. Jake did his best to reassure them and remind them of everything they had accomplished. They had survived a massive storm and won over a suspicious community and built something meaningful from nothing. They had learned skills that would serve them anywhere they went, and they had grown as individuals in ways that went far beyond simple training. Whatever the chief decided, Jake was proud of them, and he told them so repeatedly. But he also felt his own nervousness growing. Chief Nakota had changed his life completely when he left 3 alien women in Jake's care. Now the chief was returning, and Jake had no idea what to expect. Would the sisters be taken away? And would Jake's life return to its previous solitary existence? The thought of losing them created an ache in his chest that surprised him with its intensity. When Chief Nakota's shuttle finally descended onto the ranch property, Jake felt his heart hammering in his chest. The massive craft settled onto the grass with barely a whisper of sound, and the chief emerged looking exactly as he had 1 year ago. He was still 12 feet of imposing presence with glowing amber eyes and bronze skin that shimmered in the sunlight. The sisters stood before him in a formal line, their posture rigid with military precision that Jake had not seen from them in months. He stood slightly to the side, giving them space for what he assumed would be a traditional Kisha assessment. The chief walked slowly along the line, studying each sister with an intensity that made Jake uncomfortable. He asked them questions in their native language, and the conversation was too rapid and complex for the translation devices to fully capture. Jake caught fragments about their work and their learning and their adaptation to human ways. Then the chief turned his attention to Jake, and the human rancher felt suddenly very small under that penetrating gaze. Through his translator, the chief asked direct questions that cut straight to the heart of everything. Had the sisters proven themselves worthy, or had they failed again? Had they learned humility and cooperation? Or had they simply found new ways to disappoint? Did they honor the bond that had been established, or had they treated it as meaningless? Jake felt anger rising in his chest at the harsh tone of these questions. These sisters had worked harder and learned more and grown more than anyone had any right to expect. They deserved recognition, not interrogation. Jake answered honestly, but he also answered with passion. He told the chief about the storm they had weathered together, and how the sisters had saved the ranch through their quick thinking and incredible strength. He described the relationships they had built in the community, and how they had changed people's minds about aliens through patience and genuine kindness. He explained the innovations they had brought to ranch operations, and the human knowledge they had absorbed and integrated with their own understanding. But more than any of that, Jake talked about character growth. He spoke about how Kayla had learned to balance strength with compassion, and how Nira had discovered the value of patience and careful planning, and how Zeta had matured from an impulsive youth into a thoughtful young adult. These were not the same Keisha who had arrived a year ago. They had transformed themselves through hard work and honest self-examination. Then Jake said something that surprised everyone, including himself. He told the chief that the sisters had proven themselves worthy of returning home with full honor restored. They had completed their sentence and learned their lessons, and they deserved to go back to their people with their heads held high. But he also said that if they chose to stay, they would always have a place on this ranch, not as exiles or students or even workers, but as equals and partners and family. They had built something together that mattered, and Jake would be honored if they wanted to continue building it. His voice cracked slightly on the last words, and he felt embarrassed by the emotion, but he did not take the words back. They were true, and the sisters deserved to know that they had choices. A long silence followed Jake's declaration, and the chief studied him with an intensity that made the rancher wonder if he had just violated some important cultural rule. But then slowly the massive alien's expression changed. His stern features softened, and something that might have been a smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. The chief spoke, and this time his words carried a warmth that had been completely absent before. He said that he had chosen this ranch and this human very carefully. He had spent weeks observing Jake Morrison and studying his character and his actions. The chief had known that humans possessed something the Keisha sometimes lacked, which was the ability to see beyond surface differences and value individuals for who they were rather than what tradition said they should be. The chief explained that sending the sisters to Earth had never been pure punishment. It had been an opportunity carefully designed to teach them what true strength looked like. Not just physical power or blind obedience to tradition, but the courage to be vulnerable and adapt and build something new. The Kasha were warriors and explorers, but they were also a people struggling to adapt to a galaxy full of other species with different values. These three sisters were meant to be pioneers learning to bridge the gap between Kusha culture and the broader galactic community. They had succeeded beyond his hopes and proved that Kusha could not only survive among other species, but thrive and grow. Then came the moment that would determine everything. Chief Nakoda asked each sister individually what they wanted. Would they return to their homeworld with their exile ended and their honor fully restored, or would they choose to remain on Earth with this human who had taught them so much? It was their decision and their decision alone. The chief made it clear that either choice would be honored and respected. There was no wrong answer. The sisters looked at each other and then at Jake and then back at their chief. The weight of the decision hung in the air, and Jake held his breath, waiting to learn if the family he had found would stay together or if this was the end of something that had become more precious to him than he had ever expected. Kala spoke first, and her voice was steady and sure in a way that suggested she had spent considerable time thinking about this moment. She said that she chose to stay on Earth not because she had to, or because she feared returning home, but because she had found something here that she never knew she was missing. On their homeworld, she had been a warrior following traditions that stretched back thousands of years. She had been strong and skilled and honored, but she had never felt truly at peace. Here on this ranch, she had discovered a different kind of purpose. She had learned that strength could be gentle, and that protecting something did not always mean fighting. She had found a family that valued her for more than just her combat skills, and a home that felt right in ways her birthplace never had. She wanted to stay and continue building what they had started together. Nira followed with her typical careful consideration of every word. She explained that her methodical mind had found endless fascination in Earth's complexities and contradictions. Human civilization was chaotic and inefficient by Kusha standards, but it was also creative and adaptable in ways that her people had lost over millennia of rigid tradition. She wanted to learn more and study more and help bridge the knowledge systems of both species. But beyond intellectual curiosity, she had found something else on this ranch. She had found peace and acceptance in a place where her careful nature was valued, rather than seen as slow or overcautious. She had found people who appreciated her for who she was, and she was not ready to leave that behind. She chose to stay and continue exploring what else she might learn and become. Zeta's choice was the most emotional, and she made no attempt to hide the feelings in her voice. The young Keisha admitted openly that she had fallen in love with Earth in all its chaotic, beautiful diversity. Every day brought something new to discover, from the way morning light painted the mountains to the feeling of working with animals who trusted her completely. But more than loving the planet, she loved the family she had found here. Jake and Kayla and Nira had become more important to her than she could properly express. The thought of leaving them felt like tearing away a piece of her own heart. She wanted to stay and grow and see what else life on Earth might teach her. She wanted to be part of building something that mattered not just to Keisha or humans, but to both species learning to live together. Chief Nakoda nodded as each sister spoke, and satisfaction was evident in his expression. He told them that their choices were honored and their families back home would be proud rather than disappointed. The exile was officially ended, but their decision to remain was being recorded as a voluntary bond that would make history among Kusha people. They would be the first of their kind to formally integrate into human society, not through assignment or obligation, but through genuine choice. They would be pioneers and ambassadors showing both species what was possible when different peoples worked together with mutual respect. Before the chief departed, he had one final surprise for all of them. He presented Jake with a formal document beautifully, rendered in both Kusha script and English, translation and bearing official seals from the Kusha Confederation. The document was a formal recognition of the marriage bond, not as the punishment arrangement. It had started as a legitimate family unit recognized by both Kusha law and Earth's growing framework for interspecies relationships. The implications were staggering. Jake was not just a rancher who employed aliens. He was formally bonded to three Kusha in a relationship that carried legal rights and responsibilities across multiple worlds and legal systems. It was unprecedented and bizarre, and somehow perfectly fitting for how their situation had evolved. The chief explained that other Kusha were already expressing interest in similar arrangements, wanting to experience Earth and form bonds with humans. What had started as one chief's experiment in cultural education was becoming a blueprint for peaceful integration between species. As Chief Nakoda's shuttle lifted off and disappeared into the blue Montana sky. The four of them stood together in the yard, watching it go. The ranch that had been Jake's solitary refuge had become something entirely different. It was now a multicultural home and a working business, and a small but significant symbol of what humanity and alien species could build together when they chose cooperation over fear. Life on the ranch continued, but with new dimensions opening up constantly. The sisters began taking on more independent projects that expanded beyond simple ranch work. Kala started a training program teaching human law enforcement and military personnel about Keisha combat techniques and physical conditioning. Her sessions became famous, and people traveled from across the region to learn from her. The program brought in additional income that helped the ranch prosper even more. Neera developed a consulting business that helped ranchers and farmers optimize their operations using principles drawn from both Keisha engineering and earth agricultural wisdom. She became a sought-after expert in interspecies cooperation, and her methods were studied by scientists and agricultural specialists around the world. She wrote papers and gave lectures and proved that different species working together could achieve more than either could alone. Zeta focused on education and community building, and she established a cultural exchange program that brought young Keisha to Earth and sent human students to the Keisha homeworld. Her natural teaching ability and infectious enthusiasm made her the face of friendly alien integration. She appeared in documentaries and educational materials and helped shape how the next generation would view relationships between species. Jake continued running the ranch, but now with partners who brought skills and perspectives he never could have imagined. The operation expanded steadily, incorporating technologies and methods that blended the best knowledge from both Earth and the Keisha homeworld. The ranch became a model that other human-alien partnerships studied and tried to emulate. Researchers and diplomats and curious citizens from multiple worlds came to visit and see how it worked. The community that had initially been suspicious now embraced the Keisha sisters completely. They were invited to every local event and consulted on community decisions and treated as neighbors and friends, rather than aliens. Children grew up seeing Keisha as normal, as just another kind of person, and that shift in perspective gave everyone hope for humanity's future among the stars. Years passed, and the ranch continued to prosper and evolve. The bond between Jake and the sisters deepened into something that transcended any cultural definition of family or marriage or partnership. They were people who had chosen each other across the vast gulf of species difference. They supported each other through challenges and celebrated victories together, and built something meaningful from circumstances that had seemed impossible at the start. Other Keisha began seeking similar arrangements, and the program that had started with 3 dishonored sisters became a established pathway for Keisha who wanted to experience Earth and form genuine bonds with humans. Chief Nakota's gambit had proven more successful than even he had anticipated. On warm summer evenings, Jake and the sisters would sit together on the porch looking out over land they had worked and improved and protected together. They talked about the future and about the growing cooperation between their species and about the endless possibilities that lay ahead for people willing to bridge differences with understanding and effort. The marriage bond that Chief Nakota had declared on that first bewildering day had seemed like an absurd imposition at the time, but it had become the foundation of something remarkable and real. It proved that families could form in unexpected ways, and that different species could not just coexist but truly thrive together. It showed that the most bizarre beginnings could lead to the most beautiful outcomes if people approached them with open minds and honest hearts. Jake Morrison had started as a lonely rancher, trying to make a living on harsh Montana land. Now he was something more and something better. He was a bridge between worlds and a teacher and student and a husband in the most unconventional sense imaginable. Most importantly, he was part of a family that proved love and loyalty, and belonging knew no boundaries of biology or culture. The barn that had once sheltered only horses and equipment now housed 3 of the strongest beings Jake had ever known in body and spirit. As sunset painted the sky in colors that still amazed Zeta, after all this time, Jake looked at his unusual family and felt nothing but gratitude. The universe had thrown them together in the strangest way possible. But somehow, against all odds and expectations, it had worked out exactly as it should. They had found each other across the stars and built something worth keeping. That was enough. That was everything. The barn smelled like hay and wood and old machinery, and Jake watched the three Keisha women take in their new surroundings with expressions that ranged from curiosity to uncertainty. The space was big enough for tractors and farm equipment with high ceilings supported by thick wooden beams, and a loft area where Jake stored hay bales. There were several empty horse stalls along one wall and a workshop area with tools hanging on pegboards. Natural light came through windows set high in the walls, and dust motes danced in the beams of afternoon sun. It was a practical working space, and Jake suddenly felt embarrassed that this barn was going to be their home. Kala stepped forward first, and she was clearly the leader among the three sisters. She was the tallest, with silver markings along her cheekbones that caught the light when she moved her head. Her amber eyes studied everything with an intensity that made Jake feel like she was cataloging every detail for future reference. Kala spoke through her translation device, and her voice came out strong but with an edge of vulnerability that surprised Jake. She introduced herself properly and then introduced her sisters, with formal words that suggested this was important to Keisha culture. Nira was the middle sister, and she had a stockier build with broader shoulders and fewer of the metallic markings that decorated Kyla's face. Her expression was calmer and more thoughtful, as if she was already analyzing how to make this situation work. Zeta was the youngest, and she seemed barely able to contain her energy as her eyes darted around the barn, taking in every detail from the old saddles hanging on the wall to the collection of hand tools in the workshop. Despite being over 10 feet tall and capable of incredible strength, Zeta had an almost childlike enthusiasm that made Jake think she might be easier to work with than her older sisters. Jake cleared his throat and tried to figure out where to begin. He explained that the barn was the only building large enough to accommodate their size, and that he would work on making it more comfortable for them. He gestured to the loft area and suggested they could use it for sleeping once he reinforced the floor and brought in proper bedding. The sisters listened carefully, and Jake noticed that they stood in a way that suggested military training, with their posture perfectly straight and their attention focused. Kala asked practical questions about water sources and food storage and temperature control during winter. Her questions were intelligent and showed she was already thinking about long-term survival, rather than just immediate comfort. Jake found himself impressed despite the bizarre circumstances, and he answered each question as honestly as he could. Nira spoke next, and her voice through the translator was measured and calm. She asked Jake about Keisha dietary needs and whether earth food would be sufficient for their metabolism. Jake admitted he had no idea, but the chief had mentioned they could eat most carbon-based foods. Nira nodded and suggested they start with small amounts of different foods to see how their bodies responded. She explained that Keisha had very efficient digestive systems, but they required large quantities of food because of their size and muscle mass. A single meal for one of them would probably equal 3 or 4 meals for Jake. The rancher did some quick mental math and realized his grocery bills were about to become astronomical. He would need to buy in bulk and probably make trips to wholesale suppliers in the city. Zeta had been exploring the workshop area while her sisters talked, and now she held up an old wrench that looked tiny in her massive hand. She asked what it was for, and Jake explained basic tool usage and mechanical repair. Zeta's eyes lit up with interest, and she asked if she could learn about earth machines. Jake found himself smiling despite his anxiety about the whole situation. At least one of them seemed genuinely excited to be here rather than treating it as pure punishment. He told Zeta that he would teach all 3 of them everything they needed to know about running a ranch, and that included machinery and tools and animal care and everything else. If they were going to be here for a year, they might as well make themselves useful and learn skills that could help them. Kayla asked a question that made Jake pause. She wanted to know about the marriage bond that the chief had established, and whether humans took such things seriously, or if it was just empty ceremony. Her tone was not accusatory, but genuinely curious and perhaps a bit challenging. Jake leaned against a workbench and considered his answer carefully. He explained that this was not a typical human marriage and that he had not expected or wanted to be suddenly responsible for 3 alien women, but he also said that when he gave his word about something, he kept it. The chief had performed their ceremony, and Jake had stood there and participated, and that meant something. He was not the kind of man who would agree to protect and teach someone and then abandon them when it became inconvenient. If they were here under his responsibility, then he would honor that responsibility to the best of his ability. Something changed in the way the sisters looked at him after that. The military rigidity in their posture softened slightly, and Kayla nodded as if he had passed some kind of test. Nira asked what Jake expected from them in return, and he thought about it for a moment before answering. He told them that ranch life required hard work and cooperation and honesty. The land did not care about excuses or complaints. You either did what needed doing or you failed. He would teach them everything he knew, but they had to be willing to work and learn and adapt. He also said that despite their size and strength, they needed to be careful around his animals and equipment because both could be damaged easily. The sisters agreed to his terms, and Jake felt like they had established the beginning of some kind of working relationship. Even if none of them knew exactly what it would look like, Jake left them to explore the barn, while he went to his house to think and make some calls. He needed to figure out logistics for feeding 3 massive aliens, and he needed to somehow explain this situation to the few people in town he dealt with regularly. He also needed to start planning modifications to the barn to make it livable for Keisha, who were used to a completely different environment. As he walked across the yard, Jake looked back at the barn and saw Zeta's head poking out of one of the upper windows as she examined something. The sight was so surreal that Jake had to stop and just stare for a moment. This was his life now. 3 giant alien women living in his barn and depending on him to teach them how to survive on Earth. He shook his head and kept walking, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake, or if this might somehow work out better than he feared.